السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. نخب فكرية عالمية اجتمعت في روسيا لتوصيف شكل تحالفات الغد وملامحها وإلى أين، لا سيما في ظل التطورات المتسارعة والخطيرة في المنطقة والعالم. المؤتمر السنوي 13 لنادي فالداي للمناقشة وتبادل الآراء والخبرات في هذا الحوار والجزء الثاني من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. روسيا لا تخطط للعدوان على أي أحد. كلمات حاسمة أطلقها الرئيس الروسي فلاديمير بوتين عقب نشر سفينتين حربيتين صغيرتين على متنهما صواريخ كروز البعيدة المدى في منطقة بحر البلطيق. وبهذه النبرة دحض بوتين كل المزاعم في ظل تهديد متنام باندلاع حرب عالمية ثالثة، ولا سيما أن الناتو وروسيا يتسلحان ويبنيان قواتهما بشكل لافت. من جهته أكد الجانب الروسي أن تعزيز قوته في المنطقة جاء كرد على حشد قوات الناتو عدد ما يقارب 4000 جندي من دول غربية مثل ألمانيا وكندا وغيرها من دول حلف الأطلسي في المنطقة، فيما أعلنت بريطانيا أنها ستنشر طائرات مقاتلة في رومانيا عام 2017. وتزامن ذلك مع تعهد الولايات المتحدة بإرسال المزيد من الجنود والدبابات والمدفعية إلى بولندا، وبهذا يكون أكبر حشد عسكري على الحدود البولندية مع روسيا منذ الحرب الباردة كما يشير المراقبون. أما قوة 4000 جندي شرق أوروبا والبلطيق فهي رد مدروس للتقديرات الغربية أن لدى روسيا 330 ألف جندي متمركزين على الجناح الروسي الغربي بالقرب من العاصمة موسكو بحسب أمين عام حلف الناتو. كروك الدبلوماسي الأوروبي السابق ومؤسس ومدير منتدى النزاعات يحدثنا عن روسيا والولايات المتحدة والصين، وما صرح به أحد المشاركين في لقاءات نادي فالداي الروسي بأن تلك البلدان الثلاثة ستحدد مستقبل العالم، وأن الصراع ما بين الولايات المتحدة والصين هو حتمي ولماذا، ويشرح الأزمة المالية العالمية ومن هي الدول الأكثر والأقل عرضة لها الآن. Alistair Crook, former EU diplomat, founder and director of Conflicts Forum, welcome again to من الداخل from the inside, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on your program again.
It's always our pleasure, sir. Well, last week we were talking about the various participants, topics, and the tone of the speeches that were there at the Valdai Club meeting in Sochi in Russia. Now, to what extent do you believe, Alistair, that this style of discussion is needed today, given the great changes taking place in the world?
Oh, I think it's just absent. I mean, we don't have these discussions. And I mentioned on your program last week that one of the main themes that President Putin was saying is, you know, many of these things, they just can't be discussed. I mean, like the anti-ballistic missile treaty, from which the United States withdrew unilaterally, and there've been no discussions. Russia keeps asking for discussions. This is a thing which is very dangerous. I mean, is the margin between the possibility of war. Missiles, I'm sure all your viewers remember, the question of positioning missiles led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which led us that close to war before. But now it's not discussed. It's a unilateral action by the United States. So I think discussion, even if it's difficult, and the atmosphere, as I mentioned on last week's program, was not one of great engagement, at least by many of the Americans. There was certainly one particular exception to that amongst the Americans. It was not universal, but it was hard. The Russians were polite and courteous, but
But there are many
under pressure.
Russophobes, perhaps, in the U.S. today that
Yes.
just try to keep a long, faraway distance from the Russians.
Yes, but these were supposed to be at this meeting. These were the Russia experts, people who spoke Russia, who'd been following it for years, who could read the Russian press, yet all spoke from a single sort of narrative, which was the narrative of the New York Times and the Washington Post, not the narrative that they could read and listen to. And the discussion in Russia is very, very different. In the West, it's not mentioned, but if you look at the talk shows and the programs in Russia, all this period, it is about how the West is preparing for war with Russia and the dangers of a major war with the West. Whether they have it right or wrong, this is a major perception of the Russian people and its leaders, and the West seems not to hear any of this, to be completely closed off, not to understand these fears and these vulnerabilities that are taking place in Russia. They tend to wave it and say, oh, well, this is just suits President Putin to create these tensions like this. It's much more complicated. These are the tensions that can lead to serious problems.
Allow me to go back to talk about the speech of President Putin during this discussion group. He posed a focal question. The question is, if things continue in this vein, what awaits the world? What kind of world will we have tomorrow? What kind of world will we have tomorrow concerning all what is going on around us? And this attitude, for example, by the West, by the Americans, of not trying to include themselves, of they don't want to talk to the Russians, for example. Where are we heading to? Because our region here is totally affected with however they deal with each other. And this was manifested in the Syrian issue.
In the Syrian issue, in the Ukrainian issue, and both of those were the attempts to have a dialogue have so far completely failed. It was clear the Normandy 4 meeting had not produced any success. After many changes by President Poroshenko, we see the same 3 attempts by Russia. We're heading to a very dangerous situation. A very dangerous situation which I think is now as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis. More dangerous in a certain respect. And in fact, President Putin answered that question. So I'm not, if you like, imagining what he might say. But earlier at the St. Petersburg conference, he talked to the Western press and he said to them, why can't you join up the dots? Why can't you see what's happening? It's all obvious what's happening. And if things go on as they are going on now, if there is no change, this will lead to war. That's what he said at St. Petersburg a couple of months before the Sochi. He's saying that the state of disorder is a backdrop against which it's very easy to make mistakes. It's not that he's welcoming disorder because it's going to lead to a better position for Russia. He is actually saying that there is a huge danger in this disorder, in the lack of dialogue, in the lack of ability to settle these tension points in Ukraine and Syria and the Baltics and elsewhere, with Russia being pushed up closer and closer by NATO on all sides, with NATO being within artillery distance now of St. Petersburg.
Right.
That if we go on like this, it will lead to war. What I think makes it even more dangerous in some respects than the Cuban crisis missile crisis was that there were adults that tried to de-escalate and create some sort of détente. Where are those people today? There doesn't seem to be.
There's only escalation, there's no de-escalation of whatever.
And people just don't seem to hear what Mr. Putin is saying.
Sure, but John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, he was also there with you at the discussion groups. He talked about Russia, the US and China, and that those 3 will determine the future of the world. And he says that a conflict between the US and China is inevitable if Beijing's economic and political influence in Southeast Asia continues to grow. He adds that the foreseeable deterioration in US-China relations will require Moscow to decide how to best align its interests.
Indeed he did, but he was somewhat criticized for that position because it was very much a position of simply power politics, and he suggested there was a triangulation between Russia and China and the United States, and it made every good sense for America to ally with one of these against the third.
The third.
What I think Russia, what President Putin was talking about was something quite different. This is not just slicing power here and there and redistributing it and one allying. This is the 19th century sort of balance of great powers game. But he's suggesting that there are bigger forces, bigger changes taking place in the world today that we see reflected in things like Brexit. He referred to that and to what's happening with the presidential candidate Donald Trump. With the fact that people are voting in different ways than expected in Austria and elsewhere in Europe. And he was suggesting that we're seeing something that is much more profound than simply, you know, a shift in the balance of power between Russia and China. And one of those critical things that is changing, which John Mearsheimer did not really acknowledge, is that Russia and China see a strategic shared interest in working together to try and shape a coming
economic
and
model.
Global order. That they are going to be the sources of some of the ideas for this new global order. Not because they want it's simply competition with the United States, as John Mearsheimer, but because the dynamics of the global order, of globalism itself, are leading us into disorder, and that someone has to take a lead, and China and Russia are likely to be those countries that are taking a lead. So this is not simply about a question of a static balance, a triangulation of power. We're entering into a new era and where power is going to be shifted in many different ways. And on the last program, we only touched on it. But technology and other things are taking power away from the West and are shifting it to other centers of power.
Right. Now, Alistair, global stability can't be achieved unless there is a global economic progress. Today, there is a huge financial crisis that perhaps has just started taking more power and showing itself more. And this item is very focal for tipping the balance of politics. Before, we used to talk about the financial item and the political item not intersecting, each one is a separate sphere. Now we see each one affecting the other.
Yes, that's absolutely so. And because we're seeing the end of this long period, decades-long period, where we've depended on one type of economic model. In other words, this financialized, debt-led model of investment, and it's reached the end of the road. But it's also left us with huge debts. The global debts now reach 2.5 times the total global output. It's impossible for some of these things to be repaid, and we've got ourselves caught in a system of negative interest rates, which are damaging many models of business, and quantitative easing, which has become a drug for the markets without which they cannot do. And the only way out of this was thought to be growth. But growth is not going to be available as it has been in the past in this way. But what is the meaning of this? It has two huge meanings. One is, of course, that as we see in some of the reports done by a leading think tank, McKinsey, have said, for 500 to 600 million Europeans, they've seen no growth or reduction of their incomes, their real incomes, since 2005. 11 years with no real income growth, because there is no growth. And that has left people really at the economic edge, pushing them to crisis point.
Which countries are the most vulnerable for this financial crisis now?
We're all going to be affected by it. We're
Yes.
all
Who are
clearly
the
going to
least
be affected.
vulnerable? so
I
to
think
say?
those countries that are least meshed into the globalized world financial order. Countries like Iran, which is less involved in it because of the sanctions and the history of isolation. Russia, to a certain extent. Those countries that are not so dependent on raw materials. Africa will be very vulnerable to it because it's so dependent on raw materials and oil for its future. Those are the sort of countries that will be
Yes.
lesser or more affected.
Alistair, allow us to stop now for a short break, and then after the break we're going to talk a bit more
Okay.
about Aleppo and Mosul, of course. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
ما بين حلب والموصل، ما هي ملاحظات أليستر كروك الدبلوماسي الأوروبي السابق حول التغييرات في اللهجة التي تطرأ على الخطاب الغربي المتعلق بخيارات مكافحة الإرهاب اعتماداً على الموقع؟
It's no point going into hypocrisy in Western policies because we all know they're hypocritical. I mean, it's evident that they're using. And Mosul is basically about the US elections. I mean, the desire to try and show a success for the United States against Daesh in the region is about a legacy for Obama, is about the Democratic Party showing that it's capable of fighting terrorism, because Trump has been saying, actually, you're responsible for some of this terrorism. Actually, you were the people that created, in a way, as it were, a Daesh. And so they want to respond by showing a defeat of it in Mosul. Whether it'll lead to a defeat of Mosul is very problematic.
But why does the media, the mainstream media, always focus on a humanitarian issue in Aleppo and just turns a blind eye to a humanitarian question in Mosul? I mean, you know, amid UN's own warnings of the looming humanitarian catastrophe, addressing the situation, White House spokesman John Earnest said that delaying the operation due to humanitarian concerns does not make sense.
Because for some years, really from at least 1997, America has shifted to what I call the sort of geopolitics of inflamed sentimentalism, of using, if you like, the images of a baby dying in the arms of its mother, of a boy covered in the dust of a recently bombed apartment building sitting in an ambulance. They use this because, why? Because this heart-wringing images are designed to erase people from asking the geopolitical questions. Why has this happened? What is the geopolitical strategy in this? What is going on in this? It erases it because the emotional content of it just simply eclipses the discussion about why is it different in Aleppo from Mosul, because they just show a dead child and say, look what this Air Force has done. They have just, this must be stopped.
But there is also a sense like in recent weeks, Russia has deployed also nuclear-capable missiles to Kaliningrad, its territory bordering Lithuania and Poland.
Precisely.
And held civil defense drills with measures to protect against chemical and nuclear attacks. Now, these actions, Alistair, in tandem, of course, with high tensions going on in different dossiers related to Russia, have fueled speculation about the prospect of a nuclear war.
But this is inevitable from what has been happening. Yes, because we have seen over these years that NATO has moved closer and closer and is now sitting literally on Russia's frontiers. The Russians feel this intensely. And what they are signaling back is that, okay, if you want to if you like, withdraw from the nuclear agreements, then we have no option because to defend ourselves, because you're threatening our second strike ability, actually to threaten the use of nuclear weapons, to make the nuclear threat visible to the West, to say to the West very clearly, if you push us too far, if you push us into our own country, then we have no option. Because you are putting your missiles right up on our border now, we have no option but to use nuclear weapons in return. And America is moving the same track. There is a new doctrine which is we can dial up or dial down the yield of our nuclear weapons, Western nuclear weapons. So there is a new doctrine which is called escalate to de-escalate, in which America thinks we'll send them a low-yield nuclear weapon to force a de-escalation with Russia. This is nuts. I mean, it's really nuts to think that sending a low-yield nuclear weapon towards Russia somehow will de-escalate. But these are the sort of doctrines that are being discussed in America. So is it a surprise that Putin is actually saying to them, look, watch out, don't think you can just steamroll over us, move all NATO right up to our borders, threaten us with missiles,
Poland
and that
and
there
Romania.
is now going to be no pushback from Russia. If you think that, you're making a bad miscalculation. That's what it's all about.
Now, what about Israel? Why is Israel so forgotten in all this chaos and madness? Nobody mentions Israel.
I don't think it's forgotten at all. I just think at the moment we are in another pattern of politics. But that politics will come back to the issue of Israel, because Israel is in many ways central to this issue. And of course, Israel will be looking at the shifts in Syria and what happens to Syria with some anxiety. Israel, of course, as has been quite explicit, has been looking to Nusra, if you like, as its buffer zone in the area. And if Nusra and ISIS are destroyed, and I think the Secretary General of Hezbollah mentioned that recently in a broadcast, he said, Israel will be saying to America, if you destroy Nusra, you destroy ISIS, who's going to protect us in the world ahead? I mean, really, we're talking, in these years we've created a monster with Nusra and ISIS and with these radicalized groups. And now they're out of our control. They are too weak to take over the whole region, but too strong to be put back in the box.
Would Israel be also out of control regarding all this status quo?
It must be looking at the region very carefully and thinking, how is it going to be likely that they can maintain their military edge for the next 10 or 15 years with new defense architectures coming into being involving Russia, Iran. I mean, these states are changing enormously. Iraq is becoming powerful. We're seeing it involved in Mosul. Iran is already a powerful strategic state. Syria's army has been fighting for all these years against great odds. And the Gulf states are much weaker because of the financial situation and because of oil at well under $50 a barrel. And we all know that there's financial stress in the Gulf states.
Right.
So things are shifting, and of course this will have an impact on Israeli thinking about the region.
Alistair, actually I have lots and lots of other questions, but time has run short for the second part of our interview. Mr. Alistair Crook, former EU diplomat, founder and director of Conflicts Forum. Again, many thanks indeed for joining us.
No, it was a great pleasure.
It was a great pleasure to have you, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة، ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا @الميادين.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك. من الداخل، من كل فريق عمل من الداخل، من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.